10 days of blood and fire. Dozens of billions spent. Still, the US hasn't won. Iran has struck back. 34 rounds of missile attacks, drone swarms, and even hypersonic weapons pouring down at US and Israeli military assets. Stiff mountains, perseverant militias, and low-cost precision strikes. Every move they make seems calculated. Every US interceptor wasted is money down the drain. Donald Trump brags about America's success again. Still, he faces a dilemma few US presidents ever do: stop the war and look weak, or continue and risk a drawn-out, Iraq-style quagmire that drains resources and allies. Saudi Arabia refuses to help. Israel can't act alone. China and Russia are quietly reshaping the battlefield. So the big question is, can the US win a war Iran is prepared to outlast, or is this conflict destined to drag on, reshaping the Middle East forever? The US-Israel-Iran conflict has now entered its 10th day, and the Middle East is rapidly evolving into a new strategic stage. What began as a targeted strike has spiraled into a complex confrontation involving multiple nations, shifting alliances, and high-stakes calculations. At the center of this storm is Iran, demonstrating unexpected resilience, and Donald Trump, facing a dilemma few US presidents have ever encountered. Before going any further, let us review what happened in the past 10 days. February 28, 2026, Day 1. The US launches preemptive strikes on Iran targeting nuclear sites. Initial strikes are intended as a quick decapitation operation. Iran begins initial missile response, regional tensions spike. March 1, 2026, Day 2. And March 2, 2026, Day 3. Iranian state media confirms that dozens of top Iranian leaders have been removed. Revolutionary Guard demonstrates high-speed Fatstrada-2 missile capability. March 3, 2026, Day 4. And March 4, 2026, Day 5. The US and Israel expend hundreds of interceptors. Iran continues a low-cost drone and missile strategy. Domestic US criticism grows as military cost reaches $37 billion. Trump explores small-scale ground operations, weighing risks versus benefits. March 5, 2026, Day 6. Iran's foreign minister publicly states confidence in defeating any US ground invasion. Iran deploys Hormuz-Ishar for heavy missiles, targeting Israeli defense systems. The US is involving Ukraine for drone defense expertise. March 6, 2026, Day 7. And March 7, 2026, Day 8. Saudi Arabia officially refuses US access to airbases for Iran strikes. China's special envoy arrives in the Middle East to mediate. Regional tensions begin to stabilize. US war strategy is increasingly strained. Trump faces political and financial pressure. March 8, 2026, Day 9. And March 9, 2026, Day 10. Iran continues strikes, showing sustained capability. US naval presence escalates, multiple aircraft carriers deployed. Iran signals preparedness for 6-month high-intensity conflict. Trump expresses a desire for a ceasefire at an appropriate time, but faces Iran's demand for a permanent end to hostilities. While we are preparing the video, Iran has started the 34th round of the True Promise for strikes. Iran's response to US and Israeli attacks has been both fierce and methodical. Iran has already launched over 30 rounds of retaliatory strikes, targeting US command centers, military bases, and Israel's key infrastructure. Notably, Iran's advanced missile systems, including the hypersonic Fateh-2 and the heavy Hormuz-Ishar-4, have shown the ability to penetrate multiple layers of defense, including Israel's 7-tier anti-missile network. The scale and precision of Iran's strikes indicate a highly coordinated strategy rather than a series of impulsive retaliations. Iran is leveraging 3 main advantages. First, technological efficiency. Iran's use of drones and high-speed missiles allows for cost-effective strikes, turning expensive US interceptors into a losing proposition. As we said in previous videos, the US is throwing diamonds at mosquitoes. Reports suggest that Iran spends less than $1 million per strike while inflicting billions in damage. It is making the poor U.S. military poorer. Second, geographic defense. Iran's mountainous terrain, including the Zagros and Alborz ranges, creates natural defensive barriers, complicating any potential U.S. ground invasion and extending supply lines for attackers. Third, mobilized militias. Beyond its formal military, Iran can rely on thousands of trained militias, mostly former Revolutionary Guard members, providing a flexible and resilient force that can sustain a prolonged campaign. Iran has also set clear conditions for any ceasefire. The conflict must end permanently. Trump wants to end the war at an appropriate time, but Iran says no. The US and Israel start the war, and Iran decides when to end it. Past US-Iran agreements, such as the 2025 ceasefire, were broken, and Iran is determined not to repeat that mistake. This hardline stance suggests Iran is prepared for a long, attritional conflict, confident that time is on its side, which reminds us of the Chinese army facing Japanese invaders in 1938. China spent 14 years fighting the Japanese from 1931 to 1945, and Iran is determined to protect its land and people for at least 6 months, which the US cannot afford. President Donald Trump is facing an increasingly untenable situation. He should have realized he had made a huge mistake, but it's too late. Initially, the White House aimed for a quick, decisive strike to degrade Iran's nuclear ambitions and assert US dominance in the region. However, after 10 days of combat, the results have been underwhelming. US objectives remain unachieved and military expenditures are skyrocketing, reportedly $37 billion in just the first 4 days. That's a huge amount of money, which can elevate hundreds of thousands of homeless Americans from the tent cities, or at least buy them better tents to fend off the cold weather on side streets. Trump's dilemma is clear. Stopping the war now risks appearing weak and undermining US credibility, particularly after the unilateral strikes against Iran. When America's cupdogs find that the US cannot protect its military bases in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they will think twice and thrice before betting on the US to protect them from the so-called China threat in the West Pacific. Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, Vietnam and the Philippines, particularly, will show due respect to Beijing. Of course, Trump can choose to continue the conflict, risking a drawn-out war that could deplete US resources, alienate allies, and embroil the country in another Iraq-style trap. Complicating matters, US allies are no longer fully reliable. Countries like Saudi Arabia have refused to provide US forces with airspace or bases for attacks on Iran, citing national security and economic concerns. Even Sri Lanka and other smaller nations have resisted US pressure, showing that American influence in the region is more limited than expected. Trump has tried to adjust by seeking support from non-traditional partners. The Ukrainian military, battle-hardened from 4 years of conflict with Russia, has offered expertise in low-cost, high-efficiency drone and counter-drone tactics, which could help offset US technological gaps in the Iran theater. Seeking help from a Ukrainian comedian whom he had shown deep contempt is more like a black humor. Meanwhile, the geopolitical landscape is shifting. China has successfully mediated the adoption of cooling measures, reminding regional powers of its influence. Russia is covertly supporting Iran with intelligence, complicating US operational planning, and the US is reluctant to admit it. Israel, heavily engaged, cannot act alone and is dependent on US coordination, which adds more pressure on Trump. If the war ends suddenly without achieving the goals, Israel will be upset, which is the only thing the US is afraid of. Iran has demonstrated the capacity for a 6-month high-intensity campaign, with ample missile and drone stockpiles. Their strategy favors prolonged attrition rather than confrontation, exploiting the US reliance on costly interceptors and aircraft. Iranian officials, including the foreign minister, have openly stated confidence in defeating any US ground incursion, reflecting both preparedness and resolve. In short, Iran is positioned to outlast American political and financial endurance, making Trump's pursuit of a swift, decisive victory increasingly unrealistic. Based on current dynamics, let's estimate when the war will end. 3 outlooks are probable. Short-term outlook: the following 1 to 3 months will see continued exchanges of missile and drone strikes, with neither side achieving decisive results. Iran consolidates defenses, while U.S. forces struggle with logistics and attrition. Medium-term outlook: in 3 to 6 months, U.S. war fatigue and escalating domestic criticism may force a reconsideration of objectives. Iran may demand negotiations only based on a permanent cessation of hostilities. Long-term outlook: in 6 to 12 months, without a dramatic change in strategy or regional alliances, the conflict risks becoming a prolonged stalemate, similar to Lebanon or Afghanistan-style attritional wars with periodic escalations. A plausible scenario is that the war could last until late summer or early fall, with a negotiated cessation possible only if the U.S. and Israel accept a status quo that allows Iran to maintain its military and political autonomy. Any attempt by Trump to enforce regime change is likely to fail, reinforcing Iran's confidence. The U.S.-Iran war has exposed the limits of American power and highlighted Iran's strategic resilience. Trump faces a classic dilemma: act decisively and risk an unwinnable attritional war, or negotiate and risk appearing weak. Iran, meanwhile, has demonstrated both the capability and the will to sustain a long-term defense, backed by technological efficiency, geographic advantages, and mobilized militias. Unless there is a dramatic geopolitical shift, such as renewed Chinese or Russian mediation or significant internal U.S. recalculation, this war may continue to simmer until autumn 2026, with the Middle East enduring one of its most unpredictable crises in recent memory. What happens next could change global power, and it's happening right now.